I lead what we call the strategic services line for Caliber Security Partners. It includes risk management, risk and spend prioritization, strategy, and metrics. I also oversee the development of our suite of web applications called the Security Process Management Suite, helping security leaders manage their teams and programs. And a few housekeeping things. We're going to cover a lot of ground today, so this will be about 30 minutes. We can go over with questions. This will be recorded. Please use the chat window, and Melissa will cue your questions, and we can have a conversation. And feel free to bring those anytime during the presentation. I'm happy to stop because we're going to be covering a lot of ground. And with that, let's jump into assessing risk for compliance or for improving business decisions. So the objectives that I want to cover today, very modest. A few words just to be very explicit about the differences between compliance versus improving IT risk decisions. Then we're going to go through and we'll show you our approach and what works best on how we drive the risk estimation process across estimating impacts and incident frequencies. And then we'll talk about some more strategic questions on how do we know if all this work is actually benefiting the business, and how are we going to measure progress over time. This is one of my favorite types of presentations because we'll do this in the backdrop of a case study. This is modeled off some previous work I did for a healthcare organization who developed web applications. So let's jump in. There we go. I dug deep into my clip art archives for this one. I like this visual. Maybe it's a bit over the top for a metaphor, but I like this guy showing to have a conversation of the difference, where our auditor, I don't think he's sleeping there. I think he's just focused on his job, which is verifying that that control effectiveness meets policy. And I don't know if he's just polishing the floor, but that's kind of a metaphor that I like. It's not his job to make sure that investments are aligned to business objectives, or that performance is being measured, that the right amount of security is being performed. He just wants to make sure that security is being performed according to policy and the control objectives and the framework that he's using. And this is one of my favorite visuals, and the goal here is to move from an implicit conversation about how much we should spend in security and make it an explicit business conversation. The compliance is going to drive the work that we must do, defining that floor for security spend. With the risk management process, we can elevate that and discuss work that we should do. Do we want to build our IT services that are legally defensible? So if a breach was to occur, or if we get into a lawsuit, are we able to demonstrate that we do have a set of IT services that are managing consumer, customer, or critical infrastructure risk to an acceptable level? And then at the top then, and as the business advances on its strategy, do we have a process to make sure that the risk tolerance is known and that it's being met? And again, before I'm going to move pretty quickly, so feel free to use the chat function. As I go through the slides, I may not see it, so Melissa, please feel free to interrupt me with questions. So here's the workflow for the rest of the conversation. We're going to run through, and I'll share just some salient points on the differences between conducting that compliance audit. Then we'll highlight those from a risk estimation perspective that will drive the investment prioritization, not just to get compliant, but also to discuss if we need additional investment to address business risks. And then to answer those questions at the top of the show, what are performance-based metrics? Which ones should we invest in? The metrics are one of my favorite topics, but usually they're in response to a reaction, say an incident. Compliance doesn't require performance-based metrics. I think it would be a different world if they did, um, as long as they were done in the correct way. So I'll show you our approach and what through these 4 steps, um, how we perform this in context of the case study that I mentioned. So the bolded areas here will guide the rest of the talk. So let me switch over and let's use a visual to show the compliance piece. So I'm going to move over to this is our security process management suite. We developed a tool called Risk Communicator to conduct risk and spend conversations, and whether this is strategic or this is compliance. Let's take our example here. So we open up an assessment, and it's important to note, I think this is in the webinar description, a tool is not required. Before Risk Communicator, I had a fancy spreadsheet that I used to manage this. And just to make sure we're on the same page, so on this case study that the company was trying to meet the HIPAA regulations, which if you're familiar with ISO or PCI or any of the or the cybersecurity framework, there's this long list of control objectives, and you'll document your control effectiveness, and these will be mitigated. Maybe you're working on it, or they're not, or they don't exist. So as we go through this long laundry list, we're going to come up and wow, there's just all kinds of areas that we need to consider. So let's just look at those control objectives that we're not mitigating. So we can come back and say, across this 100 and some odd control objectives, we have 3 areas where our controls really aren't meeting the letter and the spirit of the policy. So since it's an audit context, let me switch to show the status of these. You have to develop a work plan. So say, hey, auditor, we've mitigated 98% of these, and we have work plans to address these other 3. And they'll say, great, let's see that. So part of that risk assessment workflow then is once you prioritize risks, what are you going to do to address them? So here's a construct that we use to help prioritize competing work efforts for limited budget. So we have, for our compliance objectives, we have some work efforts around improving disaster recovery, getting our arms around regulated data in storage, or improving our monitoring. These will have we need to put these in context of how important are they and how much do they cost. So this plot here, I used to do this in Excel as well, helps drive that. Where are we going to get the biggest bang, the most value for the least amount of money? And then on the budget side, this is just, of all these competing efforts, which ones are we going to fund? And how it normally goes is, hey, this is a compliant mandate. We have to spend this money. So the way we do that visually is we change the color of the icon, and it says, hey, we're going to invest in all of these areas to meet our compliance requirements. That's non-negotiable. This is something that's reported up to our board, and our compliance assessment is done. And what normally happens then is IT or an operating group gets these put on their object lists, and everybody goes around their normal business. That has to be the quickest compliance audit I've ever done. So let me bring PowerPoint back up. So we went through the compliance piece. I want to highlight some differences from an evidence-driven risk estimation perspective. And before I do that, I want to set some context. When I say evidence-driven, it's really important that we help collect as much real-world experience and quantify both the estimated impact ranges as well as uh, the the frequency of a vulnerability being successfully exploited. And the way that we do that is through real evidence. That we, we bring out my old pyramid of evidence here, and there's really kind of two groups. The kind that you find that this is what we prefer. Often we're called in after evidence finds you in the form of a security incident or uh, some pervasive audit issues. Where we really seek evidence is through agent-based attack and pen assessments. So depending on the company's size and industry, to identify what threats are out there and to test controls to see if that level of threat agent is mitigated appropriately. We'll also do this through control effectiveness reviews, intelligence services. We're getting a larger data collection around peer incidents. The industry and government and vendors are doing a much better job of sharing information, so we can really start putting some numbers around this and making it real instead of opinion. And more importantly, then is you know, and what's different from the compliance perspective is that we have a process around this, because this is a very political conversation to have. We're going to be producing estimates that are going to affect business drivers, and ultimately we're going to help drive spending decisions. So those objectives are much larger than just the information security group. So in this high-level process flow, starting on the left with the information security side, we have our standard steps of scoping the assessment, identifying the high-risk assets and the risks. We start our evidence collection. We can identify some candidates, so we're not just some mitigation candidates, so we're not just bringing problems to the table. And what I highlighted in blue there is really the key to success in my experience. And that is to really formally define who's accountable for what elements of that risk conversation. So in my experience, the information security group should be accountable, and they have the expertise to drive that likelihood estimate. What is that frequency of a vulnerability being exploited? But when it comes to the impact to the business, the business owners and the control owners really should be accountable for that. It's security's job to facilitate that conversation and to collect evidence around incidents that have occurred within the industry, but to drive that conversation and present those scenarios of, if this happens, what is the range of impact? How important is this to the business? And security can then codify that and incorporate that into the prioritization. Then when it comes to having that conversation for impact and likelihood, that has to drive a treatment decision. What are we going to do about this? And the business owner is going to be accountable for that, not the security group. That in some organizations, the security group is accountable for making that treatment decision. Every time that I see an organization like that, it really creates friction. The friction between the security group and the product groups or the rest of IT. When security lets go of the accountability for that treatment decision, things can move along really quickly. But I wanted to highlight that one area of that swim lane, if the business comes back and says, "Hey, security, go pound sand. We're going to ignore you, and we're going to accept this risk." But security kind of has a trump card, and the most effective card, in my experience, is to make sure that the right business owner, the right level in the organization, is making that treatment decision. One business unit should not be making risk treatment decisions for other business units, for example. So is the right person in the organization really signing off on this risk? All right. So let me hop over to Risk Communicator then and highlight some of those differences than the compliance workflow that we just went through. So let me, I went back too far. So I wanted to revisit the risk that we talked about from a compliance. We had, from our HIPAA control template, we had emergency operations and encryption and audit controls. And let's go to a status view. And as we go through that process I outlined in the swim lane, in this case study, we identified a couple more. The first one was pretty interesting. You'll notice in the compliance assessment, we passed the malicious software audit requirement. For this case study, the security team came back and said, we passed the compliance floor. However, we have evidence that we've had a number of infections last year. There was one exfil attempt. And then drive that conversation. Are these types of impacts acceptable for us? That it is very okay to present this risk and say, we need to collect more evidence here. We need to invest some time and money to have enough confidence in our estimates to drive a decision. And where you do have enough evidence, so for example, this web application breach, again, we might have passed the checkboxes in the compliance list, but the security team wants to make sure that that it's really operating within the right tolerance level. And how are we quantifying these impact ranges and likelihoods? So when we need to have a deeper conversation about risk, looking back to my old spreadsheet, we wanted to build a conversation around it. Here, this web app just tries to help facilitate that, of having the conversation of who does what, to what, and why do we care, and to being able to summarize that really quickly. I call it the summary is how would you articulate this risk in the elevator to a non-technical person. And once you have that who does what to what, then you can start organizing your evidence on what type of threat agent and how strong are our vulnerabilities, what controls in place do we have, and then from an impact perspective, what is the size and the type of exposure we're looking at, and are we able to quantify a range working with that business owner? And what this does is it crafts a nice story that can be actionable and help that control owner and ultimately the business owner make a decision if we should spend more. And it's important to note, that's takes a lot of work to really break down a risk like that and have an evidence-driven approach. And it's one reason why we hide all those details in an overlay, because often you don't need to go through a very detailed risk breakdown, but sometimes it's necessary if we're talking about real risk and real spend to the organization. So similar to the compliance assessment, let's go through and recall we had this project map to start showing all the different work efforts that are associated with these risks and what types of value are we receiving for these for the cost that they have. And on the budget side, recall, hey, we had some compliance efforts that we just have to do. So now you come along and say, well, we have some we have these new risks that are outside of compliance, and it's going to come. There's real money here. How much budget should we allocate to this? So this visual just helps make those decisions explicit and document those for posterity. Do we want to invest additional for, say, piloting the secure development lifecycle, or it's expensive, but we see a lot of value there, or do we want to improve the patch config to address the malware risks that we're watching? So, from the security team's perspective, as long as we're improving that decision, it doesn't matter what the treatment decision is to me, and that the right the right business owner is making that call. But as long as we have the roadmap and can drive that and document it, um, you know, we're helping out the business. But it's because it's a presentation. Let's do it all. We've got plenty of money. We're over budget, but we're going to do it anyway. All right, let's see if I can hop back to PowerPoint. Excellent. So our little delay kind of blew my timeline. So I'll cover this quickly and let me check to see if we have any questions. Okay. So the last stage there is, say we've identified some risks that are important to the business. How do we know if those are going to be operating effectively? In my example here and in that case study, okay, if we're going to do some software development lifecycle, how much is enough and how fast should we go? And in order to drive that conversation and to track the progress, we can spin up a performance-based metric. And to me, that's something that's very specific. And very quickly, that means that we're going to have a target at a point in time. And that enables a really powerful visual and a really powerful conversation. To start out with our target for, say, in our SDL example, for training or code coverage or pre-production pen tests or vulnerability fix rates. Those can be very modest to start, and that target can adjust over time. And by defining that target, it makes a really easy visual. Are we performing above it or below it? I've had this little picture for a long time, and it's not even, the axes aren't even labeled. You can just see that based on that point in time, how are teams performing. So let me show you an example of how performance-based targets can really help tell the story. So here are the software development lifecycle metrics that we put up, that we have. So across these product teams, and again, we used to do this in Excel. The web applications makes it easy to manage the data and produce the visuals. We can see across teams which ones are performing against those targets and which ones aren't, as well as have the conversation to show, hey, we're negotiating, we're working with those control groups to see how much investment and how fast they want to go. So, for example, we might start off and just have a very modest target, and then ramp that up over time. And where that target value is, in my experience, it really is and should be a discussion with the product team. And that target at that point in time really is acceptable performance, acceptable risk. If once you reach those milestones, then you can determine, hey, is this effective? Are we seeing a reduction in production vulnerabilities? Do we need more or less of this control? That's a really powerful conversation that I've only seen those happen when you have some information and it's presented in a way to drive that conversation. I know that may sound odd, but I've had multiple people come back and say, wow, we really have that oh my moment. They said, this is exactly what I need to communicate with my teams. And my inside voice, I just said, you've had this information for a year. All we did was help highlight it. Okay. So that is the fourth step in our process. And I caught up on time. We're right at 30 minutes. And feel free to reach out with questions. I covered a lot of ground. Maybe we'll do part 2 of this and get into some more details. I wanted to read you with one of my favorite reads. This is by Dan Geer that talks about a couple of performance-based measurements, in particular about incident response. Really good read. If you take one thing away from this presentation, at least I can get you to check out some of Dan Geer's work. Let's see if we feel free if there's a particular area or if there's any questions, jump in. Otherwise, I'll let you carry on with your day.